So I'd like to introduce Julia Batley first. Julia, would you mind waving so that we know who you are? Hello, Julia. So Julia is a self-employed designer maker, and she works under the name Teasel Handmade. And she's been working with leather and Liberty fabrics to make accessories over the last 10 years and sells her work through shops and galleries as well as craft fairs. And prior to that, she worked in marketing. So she's coming to this discussion from a very kind of commercial and practical point of view. She's got a passion for working with fabric and textiles since she was a child, and she's largely self-taught. So in our preliminary conversations with Julia, we had discussions around the identity of a maker and how that plays a big part in Julia's kind of craft practice. She also lives in Huddersfield and appreciates the textile heritage of the area, including the growing resurgence of small companies and individual makers who are particularly also, rendered visible through the Woven Festival, who are part of the kind of the textiles heritage in the region. She's interested in thinking about how this might move forward in an innovative way in the future, and is very interested in hearing about how other people are using textiles in different ways, whether artistically, practically, to celebrate textile heritage, and to learn if the labels art and craft are still relevant or useful for the activity that's going on at the moment. So that's Julia. Thank you for joining us today. The next speaker is Nicola Perrin. Nicola, could you wave? Thank you very much. So Nicola Perrin is a maker, craft maker, an artist, and she's also a senior lecturer on the BA Honours Textile course at University of Huddersfield. Nicola weaves cloth, she embroiders, she has an unhealthy collection of seed beads, and she makes quilts as an individual, but also alongside the Meltham Quilting Bee, which is a quilting group set up by Nicola. She paints and she draws on a weekly basis. Sometimes with her, she makes her own paints and is intrigued by paintings of textiles in particular. She teaches weave, drawing and professional craft, and she's here today to talk about what she calls the underdog, the much maligned identity of the amateur. So often considered in the craft or art field as someone who lacks ability and skill, is thought of as inferior to its artisan counterpart and is a creator of bad gifts. So she has an affinity with the thoughts of writers such as Stephen Knott, Glenn Adamson and Fiona Hackney, who recognised the amateur as the freest of all makers and the creators of the most innovative, fresh and life-affirming outputs. And just to note that Nicola is also currently completing a PhD about the changing identity of the amateur through the communal making of crafts, and she'll be talking about some of her research at the Meltham Quilting Bee. Okay, thank you very much, Nicola, for joining us today. And then lastly, we have Claire Barber. Thank you, Claire, if you can give a wave. Bless you, thank you. So Claire graduated from the Fine Art Department at the Royal College of Art in 1994 and has since exhibited widely, often completing over 20 artist in residency projects and commissioning models in the UK and abroad. Recently, she was in the 9th Biennial of Contemporary Textile Art at the Museo de Traje in Madrid, in Spain, in 2019, and an installation of her work was presented at the Contextile 18 Contemporary Textile Art Biennial in Portugal in 2018. So Claire's fascinated by the possibilities offered by textiles, and she's worked with fabric as a metaphor or an actual material throughout her career. She uses textiles in a variety of ways, particularly around the source of the work and understanding that textiles comes from a knowledge of craft skill, but using that knowledge to inform questions that relate to site specificity and social engagement. So Claire creates large-scale and small-scale works, but is interested in the dialogue between space and communities that engage on work. And she's also very interested in what the communal aspects of making processes are and how they manifest in and through the work itself. So she'll be talking about some of her work, including blue plaques of intangible experience, spinning wheels, the train track, and the basket, in the context of her role as a textile artist. So there we go. We've got three very diverse but potentially overlapping kind of contexts for our discussion today. So Julia, Tom, if you wouldn't mind popping up the images so that maybe Julia can talk us through some of her work, that would be really, really interesting. There we go. Here you are. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Well, it looks like we're going to have a really interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to it. I've been a maker, as Rowan said, for over 10 years, and I'm largely self-taught. I think the key themes in my work are colour and texture, and I work with leather and Liberty fabrics, and I really enjoy celebrating the sort of British heritage of textiles through the Liberty prints. Plus they're absolutely gorgeous fabrics, and the colours and the combinations are amazing to work with, and they kind of tell you what they want to go with. You know, it's like going into a sweetie shop, going into my workshop and seeing all the Liberty fabrics there. So working with that and putting that together with leather, it gives you this lovely textural, colourful, you know, experience. And all the things that I make are very practical. They're designed to be used every day. So I like to think of it as giving sort of everyday pleasure. So you might open up the bag that you see in the bottom, but it's lined with a gorgeous Liberty print, but you get that lovely feeling of soft leather, the smell of the leather. It's quite you know, it's quite an experience for all the senses. Which is one of the reasons I really love selling directly through events and fairs, because you kind of have to see and feel and touch to get an idea of it. I don't know if you want to move on to the next slide, Tom. Again, just to show you really, colour sort of shouts through everything that I do. So just some more examples: glasses, cases, little handbags. Yeah. Here we go, a bit more wintry range. We've got the wool scarves, and that's a more recent addition, and I've really enjoyed doing that because using the woven wool fabrics sort of ties it back in again to the textile heritage of this area. So it's really lovely to source fabrics that are woven locally. You know, I bought fabric from the Combe Valley Museum, which has been woven just 2 minutes from my door, and that's fantastic to work with. So that gives an idea. I think the other thing to say is that teasel is, as a name, is one that I picked to tie into the heritage of this area, because teasels used to be used to card the wool fabrics, and there were teasel auctions locally. So I think it's quite a local connection that ties into textiles without being too textile-y. So that's really where I come from. I'll pass you back to Tom.
There you go, Nicola, over to you.
Okay, so hello everybody. So do you want to move on to the next slide, Tom? So this is some images from some work I do with the wonderful Meltham Quilting Bee. So we work together, as you can see there, on one quilt at a time, rather than working on individual quilts. And we've got all age groups involved. And it's just wonderful being able to work on one thing together, rather than a lot of the time I spend making work just on my own as an individual. So it's a great experience working with other people. So, so that's Meltham Quilting Bee. Next slide. So yes, so these are two quilts made by the Meltham Quilting Bee. The one on the left, the turquoise and grey one, was one of the first ones that we made when we were first getting together. And then the one on the right is the third one that we did. We're a slightly smaller group now. What I love about these quilts is the many handwriting of all the different people who are working on them. So when you look at it from the front of the quilts, the stitches are all the same. we're quite good at kind of like getting that all matching up, but actually when you look at the back of the quilts, they're completely different, and there's lots and lots of different kind of styles of handwriting going on there, which I find very exciting. So next slide. So this was one of my quilts, and this was done in response to the Meltham Quilting Bee, and thinking about how we all work in the same space, kind of hunched forms, bumping knees, leaning over, sharing of sewing needles and threads, passing them along. So that was what that one's about. The next two, the one on the left is a quilt I made, which is, I call a portrait of the Meltham Quilting Bee, and the one on the right is a painted study of a quilt that I've made. I really enjoy painting of textiles, so that's that. And then I think the final slide, yes, so these are my Quilts of Delusion series. So these are all the fantasy quilts that I will make one day if I A, get the skills, and B, get the time. So but yes, so I've got a whole series of paintings of quilts that are kind of fantasy based. I don't even know if it's possible to sew them, but hey, I like to dream about these things. And that's me.
Thank you, Nicola.
Okay.
Thanks. And Claire?
Okay, so so this is an image of a project that I was doing last year with an ex-student of mine, Lee Bowser, and a local curator and writer called June Hill. It's called Blue Plaques of Intangible Experiences. And it was involving some communities that we were working with in Bradford. And like Nicola's work in many ways involved engagement with people that didn't necessarily come with skills in embroidery. We're really trying to kind of explore in this work I suppose sort of trying to reverse the perception of the media perception predominantly in Bradford of the way that communities interact, which can sometimes come across quite negatively. So, and also some of the acts of enablingness which don't necessarily really get shouted about. So that was one of the main incentives for this body of work. So did you want to move on to another slide? So this is quite interesting. It's a piece of work that actually comes out of Blue Plaques of Intangible Experiences, and it's part of a conceptual radical craft initiative set up by Unravelled, and they've done a number of quite interesting projects in National Trust buildings. And going forward, we're looking at working at the London Wetlands Centre. Because of COVID, the work has been postponed, but we will be going ahead with the project. And as part of Blue Plaques of Intangible Experiences, I've been trying to think about some of the paradoxes of being in nature and conservation, particularly environment and the relationship between the nature that you go to see, but also the metronome of things like aircraft and cars and traffic, and trying to use embroidery to sort of capture something which isn't visible. We want to involve others in that. And this has been an ongoing practice actually all the way through the period of lockdown that I've been doing, because I haven't been able to work with other people. If you want to go on to maybe the next slide. I work with really diverse materials. I'm interested in craft as a subject as much as a process. So this body of work, I was really interested in glove making, the heritage of glove making in Yeovil, which had been applied to firefighters' gloves. And some of those traditional skills, and quite an unrecognised skill. I don't think a lot of people necessarily realise how much is made in Britain by hand using very, very traditional methods. And so wanted to really open up an installation or inflatable that would involve people in negotiating this heritage in kind of new ways that they may sort of relate to, and also push their creativity in the way that they might engage with a cutting form, which is a basic shape used in glove making. So moving forward, a couple of images. On the left is some work that I was doing last year as part of the residency based in Bolton, looking at creating a contemporary handkerchief using a lot of digital print and drawing as a commemorative sort of handkerchief for the Peterloo massacre. And then the piece of work on the right is a body of work. Actually, Rowan has been involved in this, and Nicola in different kind of ways, which is trying to think about how I might engage with craft practice, both within my own individual career as an artist, but also tucking it away into university curriculums, maybe talking about things in conferences. So it's a body of work about reclaiming sleeping bags from music festivals and offering them to people who may need them, but it has quite a sort of multi-dimensional sort of aspect to it. And then maybe the next slide. And this is some work, very large scale work. So the work's about 6 meters high, working at Hull Paragon train station, filling each window, 13 windows, with digital drawings, prints and photography that is exploring the transmigration phenomena in Hull, which is again a little known history of Hull, where people who were migrating to the New World would travel through Hull on their journey and stay for a few months. And what I was interested in this project was craft that was carried with people as they took their routes to different countries, and how they adapted that craft in their new environments. And I liked the location of the station because people today are doing the same kind of thing in the way that they move, the things they carry, the skills they carry with them, and how they have to be flexible with those skills in quite a, I suppose, precarious climate that we live in today. So I think those are all the slides.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks. Fabulous. Okay, so we've got a sense of the three different, extremely different but potentially overlapping bodies of work. So I can certainly see things to do with. I mean, it was really nice what you were saying, Claire, about the idea of like what happens when you start to think about craft as a subject matter that needs investigation through an art practice or through a set of processes. Really interesting. Also, the kind of the connections between the materials, the intimacy or the intimate relationships between materials and acts of making or modes of making, but also the communal aspect to craft and to textiles. So thank you very much. I'm going to throw out the first question, which and just, you know, if you can raise your hand if you would like to respond. But I think just in, you know, riffing off what I've just said here and on your three presentations, how do you define your relationship to art and craft as a practitioner? And how might they sit together, or do you see them as being separate? Nicola.
I can go for this.
Thank you.
I'll dive in. Okay, so I'm a bit cheeky. I jump in and out of them all. So I kind of like jump in and out of art, craft, design. I do see them as different to each other, and I'm quite comfortable with that, but I definitely don't kind of like recognize hierarchies in those. I see them as quite flattened. I'm quite interested in the idea of rhizomatic kind of like thinking, where everything's kind of on a level playing field rather than having kind of hierarchies like that. But I recognize for me, and I think that it's different to each individual, but for me, I recognize when I'm working as an artist, it's the kind of like the concept, the message, the narrative that's the primary kind of like driver. How that comes about and what form it comes about is kind of relative to what the message is I'm trying to communicate. However, when I'm thinking about craft, I think it's the other way round. So for me, it's about a process that you really love, whether that's canoe building, whether it's keeping an allotment, whether it's knitting, whatever it is. I think that's the kind of like the central kind of force for craft. And that doesn't mean to say it can't have a message or a narrative in it, but if it does, I think it comes out of the making process and the concept of craft rather than the other way around. So I think that's my thought. But yeah, I jump between all of those different kind of fields quite happily to suit my needs. So yeah.
Sorry, Rowan. I think for me it is quite a difficult question, and often I feel a million miles away. I feel the disciplines are very, very distant, very far apart. And then at other times, it depends on what kind of season you might ask me the question, because at other times they feel very, very close and almost indistinguishable. And I think for me, I always feel I really value the fact that I've been making work over a period of years, because sometimes I'm not aware of that relationship between something I've made and craft, and I become aware of it over time. So there's work that I've made which doesn't look like textiles, but then I understand it as textiles. And then there's other works where I've really confronted craft issues, like the work that I did in Hull for transmigration, when I felt that subject of craft was really evident. But it was presented as a public art, piece of public art. So I think it's a very private experience of craft, which my audience wouldn't necessarily tap into in the same way that I would tap into. So yeah, I've also really valued working with curators and the insightful way that a work might be positioned or contextualized. So it might emphasize links which I wasn't really aware of. So a couple of years ago, I worked with a work around Renaissance mechanics. And I am interested in engineering, mechanical engineering, alongside other things, but it really emphasized that in terms of how I was positioned alongside printmakers or painters or sculptors who are interested in that subject as well. But I recognized that I saw that through the lens of craft practice in a different way than maybe the other people that I was exhibiting with. So it's really, yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I do feel like, in a way, like Nicola, that they are distinct and they should be distinct. But there's a sort of paradox when sometimes you can't pull them apart as well, you know, so it's not something you can sort of say is black and white, I think, for me personally, in a relationship with green art and craft, although at different times I will feel incredibly determined about what I feel, but I will change and I'll evolve and then I will contradict myself in terms of my things. So it's sort of an evolving relationship, I think, for me.
And I guess that also kind of maybe like leads into thinking about when we talk about craft identity as distinct from an artistic identity. There are many different, well, I don't know, maybe this is my hunch, but there are many different kinds of labels for craft identities. So you could, for example, you know, identifying as a craft practitioner, a designer maker, a maker, you know, a textile designer. Do you feel that, I mean, what do you feel about those multiple identities being visible or in flow in the craft world? Is that apparent to you? Is that a good thing? Yes, Julia. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are lots and lots of different labels, and I think craft can be seen in lots of different ways, and I think sometimes it's how you label yourself that matters. But I think if you mention craft, I think a lot of people think of two extremes really on the surface. Think of a heritage situation, so the skills that we mustn't lose, you know, whether that be making coracles or I don't know, a thatcher, or, you know, these heritage craft skills. But on the other hand, you know, people think of contemporary craft, which can be very high end, and, you know, that's where the label between art and the craft becomes blurred. So, I mean, I personally like to be called a designer maker, because I think, you know, I design a product and I make it. So whether you call me a crafter, I don't know. I think crafter sometimes has negative connotations. It's something that Nicola might come in with her view of amateur. You know, this idea of amateur craft. I'd be interested to see what Nicola has to say about that. But I think the perception depends on the audience, and everybody comes with their own preconceptions about what craft is. So yeah, I don't know. Throw it out to somebody else.
Yes. Yep. Maybe you both keep your mutes off, and you can.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, I actually find them very difficult terms. I find all of those terms difficult because they suggest to me a product and a product orientated approach, and an individual artist or an individual practitioner. And I'm kind of interested in making, which is broader than that. I'm interested in making work that does not necessarily enter a gallery. I'm interested in work that can be given away. I'm interested in work that can be made by others. I'm interested in work that can be situated in a useful object, but you don't necessarily recognise it as such. I'm interested in how art can be useful to others in non-material ways. And so I find those terms really difficult. But I do relate to textile artists because I know more about the history. And so understanding the history and how that has evolved over the last kind of 90 years is really useful to me to know. But in their own right, yeah, I find it's a difficult identity to relate to, because it feels too rooted in the tangible. And I'm kind of interested in the tangible, but I like also the liberty to go outside of that. But I think, like many people who are attracted to craft, there is also this sense that the boundary is really useful. So the boundary that you have means that you kick that around and you move it and you decide to leave it and come back to it. So I do also have this kind of strange pull, and I feel like I need to leave it, come back to it. And it's like, sometimes I feel I'm disloyal, and then I feel I'm overly loyal. You know, there's this pull to and fro motion, which is, I think, quite interesting because of the tension that creates in the practice that doesn't sit easily, you know, within those terms. So yeah, like then I would find it awkward to use those terms to describe my work, although if other people describe my work as such, and it means that I can make more work, I will take that term on because I want to make work, you know. But personally, I find it kind of awkward.
Just to flip it, Claire, so that push and pull and that difficult relationship with, and not wanting to be contained by any one of those identities, would you say that is an indispensable part of what you have to negotiate in an artistic practice?
I think that, I mean, I came through a really interesting era when I was doing my MA, because it was the early 90s. And so, you know, the canon of art was accepting textiles with open arms. You know, we had Tracy Emin, you know, being presented at the Tate for her, all the people I've ever slept with, 10, you know, and those kind of works meant that, you know, that there was a real liberty to work in lots of different ways. So it's different, I think, if you come from a craft background than if you don't, because you do have that kind of loyalty to the discipline, and it's something that is kind of, you know, the more you work, the more you get closer and closer to thinking that you might even be a crafts person. I wouldn't like to think I'm a crafts person because I don't practice enough, but sometimes I feel I'm almost getting there. You know, so it's really, yeah, so I think it's different. Whereas I think if you come from an art background, that's not an issue at all for a lot of artists. You know, craftsmanship, I'm happy to get other people to make my work if they make it better than I do. And I've gone to companies to get things made for me. But sometimes I feel I really need to make work myself, because there is a voice in the way that or there's something, a way that I engage with materials, a voice that somebody else can't take on for me. And also, it's not only that, I'm learning about what I'm trying to express in the making process. So there is this thing with craft that I think is distinctive if you have trained in it, and you realize your limitations and how you're failing all the time because you're not reaching craft status, but at the same time you're trying to express ideas. So there's kind of tension. I'm not sure that fine artists trained as fine artists from necessarily carry that baggage necessarily in the same way that you do if you're trained in craft.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire.
Yeah.
I mean, so then just Nicola, I wonder whether you can talk to this question about amateur craft identity in this context.
Yeah.
So,
well, personally, I don't know. I don't think I've thought about it as much as you have, Claire. I'm not that bothered, but maybe, I don't know. I think, and I've had this conversation with people I work with on quilts, but I wonder if it's kind of my privilege, because I have been formally trained in textiles and design and fine art and all of these things, and so I'm really lucky. So I'm not worried about being called an amateur. It's like, yeah, that's fabulous. I love that idea of kind of like, especially when we think of amateur work as being kind of like free from kind of like the constraints of everything. So I'm really happy with that. But I know that it's not necessarily, it's always kind of like associated with somebody who doesn't make something very well. So I think that people maybe who haven't been formally trained don't like that kind of term, and so I recognize that these terms kind of create turmoil, I suppose, for people, but personally I'm kind of quite open to these things. I really like the term designer maker, and with you, Julia, there, I love the fact that you design something and you make something and it's just straight to the point. And I guess I think that's why I like the term kind of like amateur, really, in that it just kind of like, I define it as somebody who's doing something who is not wanting to make money from it. So it doesn't mean that you're not good at making something. And in fact, there's a government report, a massive, the community, I can't remember what it was called, Rowan, the crafting, big report that was written a few years ago, government report, and it talks actually in there about how quilters, amateur quilters, are the absolute kind of like the highest in status in terms of quality of making and ideas and forward thinking. And I think that applies to hand knitters, crocheters, and a whole range of different people, that actually people who are not tied to kind of like making money from something are able to kind of like make something which is much more open to possibilities.
yes, Julia.
Interesting as well about saying that it's not about how you label yourself, it's about how other people label you and how that opens up opportunities. And so, you know, I come from an amateur background. I've self-taught, you know, I've been saying for a lot of years, but I am self-taught. But the labels craft and art, as I said at the beginning, I come from a commercial aspect. You know, I am a designer maker to make a living. That's where I'm coming from. So it doesn't really matter to me whether you call me an artist or a crafter or a maker. I like designer maker. But what it does matter is it can limit access to opportunities. You know, in terms of fairs and markets and opportunities. You know, some people will consider craft to be, will include the kind of work that I do, and that's fine. You know, I've been to art markets where I can be included in one thing and I can be rejected from another because I'm not art, which I accept. But it does have a practical implication on a day-to-day basis, and so that's really the only reason I'm bothered about that label from a real life, you know, trying to make a living from what I do kind of point of view. It's not a conceptual thing to me. It's a practical reality.
Absolutely. Which maybe leads on to my next question, which is probably a bit of a tricky one. But I think there might be something going on here around value, okay, and the values that are that we attach to art craft, or the art craft relation. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about, maybe with reference to your own experience, but what are the values that we are that are maybe kind of attached to textile art and craft making, that are kind of visible and obvious, you know, so that might have something to, you know, the commercial value that we might attach to, you know, things coming out of, you know, designer maker identities. But like, if we're thinking about all of the different kinds of values that we might need to give to or recognize within textile art and craft, which ones are important to you? So I'm thinking about, especially with the communal aspect, the social values, aesthetic values, you know, community values, the values of making, as much as commercial. So if we're saying that there are multiple values at work in this kind of, in this world, like, which ones do you give priority to or consider to be important for your work and the identity of, you know, art craft?
I just think it's interesting what Julia was saying actually before about opportunities and making a living, and there is monetary value. And I as well, for many years, needed to make a living out of being an artist, and I'm still, a lot of my works are too expensive to make unless I get funding. So I think that the occasions when I have worked on projects which are solely textile art, the first time I did it, I was shocked at how little I was paid in comparison to how much I was paid on fine art projects. And so I took the project on because it was so flamboyant, and in many ways had a lot of incredible elements to it. But I was really irritated by the fact that I wasn't paid the proper wage for that project. And I also think that even though I'm an academic now, it's not good enough to not have monetary value for textile crafts or art, because if I don't get funding for people that I'm working with on a proper wage, you know, it's not fair. And if I take positions, you know, it's just not good for everybody else in a sense. So, you know, so I think that this is quite problematic in a way, in terms of how the discipline can grow in a genuine way. Or you take on something and you may find that you're actually exhibiting with a range of academics, you know, which can't be a healthy, diverse community, because you can't make a living out of doing textile art. But you can as an artist, you know, from my experience, because there's just so many more avenues that you can get funding, you know, and so much the infrastructure is so much more solid, you know, in terms of the whole management of art practice. So I think that's you know, monetary value. But I got a sense in you asking the question, you weren't really looking at monetary values, that possibly more about the communal values that we've been discussing, or social values, which you know, is a completely different kettle of fish, which actually textiles can create such positive experiences, you know, for people. And there can be so much kindness that you can communicate through textiles, and you can, you know, that sort of empathetic kind of quality that you can work with in textiles is really, really fascinating. And I think I was really lucky that I was introduced in 1992, so it's only been in a year in publication, to Susie Gablique's book, The Reenchantment of Art. And it's taken me like a few decades to figure that book out. But like, I was really lucky to have that at that time, because art seemed so kind of product based in the early 1990s. You know, when you had things like Sensation, the Royal Academy, such, you know, it seemed very monetary value. So it was almost taking a pendulum right over the other side. And to have a book like that, which is really asking some interesting questions about, you know, how we should, I think it's so timely right now when we're in sort of ecological crisis, when there's so much uncertainty in society. It's absolutely vital that artists, craftspeople, whatever you do, you sort of engage in that, you know. And so textiles can pull people in because they have this kind of beautifulness about them that is aesthetic, it's visual, has this kind of dimension to it, but it's also sort of it's not intimidating, so you can kind of pull people in, and then you can do sort of interesting things once you have your audience, you know. So I think that they're not, I would like to say that they're important not just for crafts and art, but they should be important for all visual or performing arts, you know. These communal values right now, you know, and the way that we might find ways to live in meaningful, productive, useful ways, you know, and how we can make a contribution, you know, to society, to help out, really, you know. Not that I don't want to sound like patronizing, but I just feel that, you know, we need to sort of come together and really sort of, you know, work together to improve society.
Julia.
Yeah, I think that creativity of any kind, whether it's craft or art or whatever, has huge value to individuals and communities. You know, it's developing skills like critical thinking, problem solving. It's good for your mental health. It gives you flow. You get absorbed in it. You forget about what else is happening in the world. So I think there is huge value in making, and perhaps more so now. I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that, you know, in COVID, that there have been a huge resurgence of, you know, online art competitions, people contributing every day, or just drawing every day, or making, or even baking. You know, people have gone back to the, you know, the skills that give them satisfaction, and I don't think it's any mistake, any coincidence really, that a lot of craft comes from domestic sources. And one of the things when I was thinking about this was, you know, I was thinking about textiles in the past and how our perception of things changes over time. And I was thinking about patchwork. You know, it's not my field really, but I'm very aware of the fabrics that came out of America in the 1930s, the feed sack fabrics. You know, it was the Great Depression. There was a real, you know, people were poverty stricken, there was no money. And so the feed sack manufacturers put their feed for the farms in floral sacks. And the sacks were used by the you know, by the farmers' wives to make clothes for the family, and then the scraps of those were used for quilting, and the scraps of those were used for rag rugging. Every little thing was used, and that was seen as it was very much a practical use. It wasn't considered art, it was a necessity. But when you look back at it through the prism of time, and people consider these quilts to be artwork, and to represent the social, you know, the social times and the use of colour and, you know, individual makers, and obviously quilting's developed a long way since, and I'm sure Nicola can talk a lot more about that because it's really not my field. But I just think that's interesting, that I think sometimes craft has been underrated because it started in a domestic setting and was seen as a woman's craft often. I think there is some element of, you know, of that historical hangover, and maybe it's changing, I'm sure it is, and, you know, things have moved on an awful long way, but it was just something I thought was interesting really. But, you know, maybe sewing for those farmers' wives would have been an escape, wouldn't it? Doing something creative, and I don't know, look, and it's also a way of expressing your love. I think I always think of sewing and making things for other people as being an expression of affection, that you are willing to put your time and effort and skills into something to pass on to someone else. You know, I used to make pajamas for my kids when they're little, and I used to say, they're not just pajamas, I'm wrapping you up in love, you know, because they were handmade pajamas, and I made them for years until they said, please stop. But, I think, you know, there's a lot of emotion in textiles. Maybe again because of the domestic setting that things started. But anyway, I just thought.
Does that feed into what you're, Nicola?
Yeah, I mean, it reflects it perfectly, really. I mean, I'm kind of particularly thinking, so while I totally and utterly, and in with my professional hat on, making money out of it is obviously absolutely paramount. But I guess I'm here today to talk about kind of like the other side of it, which is where we're not making money from it. And I think it's a rare kind of like, it's a rare thing to be able to do something autonomously these days. So we've always got kind of like a manager kind of like expecting things of us, or family members. There's always things that are expected of us. And often I find that engaging in craft based activities affords us 5 minutes a week or an hour a month or whatever to be able to actually just do something that's just for the love of it. And I think that's really important to kind of have that there without kind of like any worry about whether it's kind of like good enough. And even if your children decide they don't want the pajamas anymore, that's not really the point. It's the act of engaging with it and doing it that's for me is really important. But what else was I going to say? I think the communal kind of like aspect of making for me really allows me to listen and to kind of like engage with others in a way, again, that in my working life I don't necessarily do so well. I don't know, but certainly making quilts with other people, and go from the design decisions right at the beginning to the fabric choices to what we're going to do for our quilt and where it's going to go in the end is a really kind of like wonderful opportunity to kind of like engage in something so open. I mean, when we're sewing the quilts, you don't even have full control of the line that you're making. So I would be sewing along and I would pass my needle on to the next person and they would carry on with that line. So everything in it is a very shared experience, and it's something we don't really get to do so much these days. So for me, that's where the kind of like, they're very specific values, but those are some of the values that I think are important in craft, that craft particularly brings to our lives.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you, all three of you.